Okay. Well, welcome everyone again. This is our presentation, The Cloud and What It Means for Your Business. I'm Tom Doran with ABC Computers, and joining me today is Ben Bolte. Ben leads our technical services practice and is an expert in various cloud storage opportunities and options, and so he'll be doing most of the talking, but I'll get us started. Some of you know us well, and some of you are first-time attendees, and so just by way of background, I'll give you just a little introduction to ABC. We have been in business 30 years. We have 52 people on our team.
Hey, Tom.
Yes.
You need to adjust your screen because you're only seeing out to the 4 location. You're only seeing the LO.
Oh. I wonder what happens here. Thanks, Ben. I may have to ask you to look at that for me, because I had this trouble yesterday. Is that better?
It's better. I don't see all the way down now.
Okay. Well,
I see as far as Janesville on the map, for lack of a better way of putting it.
All right. Well, hopefully you don't have anything way at the bottom of your slides. Otherwise, we may have to make you the presenter.
I think we'll be good for now.
Okay. So some of the companies, we work with a wide variety of companies, but some of the names you may recognize there. Some of our favorites obviously make ice cream, so we love the folks at Shep's, but you know, the Culver's Burgers and our friends in the apparel business. Really, what we're here to talk about today, you know, we hear it all over the place, the cloud. You see advertisements, you know, the Wall Street Journal is advertising somebody else's cloud every day. We see it on the television now. But very few people really have a good grasp of what does the cloud mean. It's almost the mystical way that some presentations make it sound. And really, the cloud isn't magic. In the most simple terms, the cloud, in however many forms it might take, means that these are servers that are not located in your building. And so Ben is going to take us through some examples that should help you better understand what the cloud is, how it relates to the networks you have in place today, and how the cloud could play a role in your future IT strategy. So, Ben, I'll turn it over to you, and you just tell me when you want me to advance the slides.
All right, just click on to advance right now. So we hear it all the time. Customers comment about how simple it used to be. You know, if you go back 5 or 10 or sometimes 15 years, it all started with just a simple application. And at some point, things started to get more complicated. And they started adding pieces, whether it was internet or email, and stuff started to snowball. What used to look as simple as this slide shows here, if you jump to the next one, Tom, it started to build out. So now there was additional things. You had web servers and SharePoint servers, SQL from a database perspective, and from a client perspective, things have really changed in the last couple of years. Tablets are becoming, instead of an oddity, they're pretty much a common tool in business now. Everyone's using a smartphone and all these different devices. And as the devices have multiplied, so has the complexity of the number of applications you're running. So it used to be just 1 or 2, and now you're dependent on 5 or 6 or more, and everything integrates together and becomes a lot more complicated. And the next thing you know, you end up with a network that looks like one in the next picture here, where you have multiple locations connected together, and you're trying to figure out how to merge all this networking together. And what ends up happening is everybody has their own version of a cloud offering. It's what is considered a private cloud because you're hosting for your other locations. And this always leads me to the question, you know, when did you decide to get into the IT business, if you look at it, everybody has their own design of how they want to work. And most of us got into it because, you know, as an earlier example, you want to make ice cream or whatever. But these other pieces are all pieces of the puzzle that you need to be able to create the product that you're making or what your company specializes in. And when we sit down and talk to C-level executives, nobody ever wants to have a big IT team. They feel they need to have it to be able to do the pieces that they need, and they always look at as IT as just an expense. And to build off of that, you know, we tell customers all the time, well, although IT is an expense, it should be an asset to your company. It should provide value that you can't do with just people power. So, you know, the questions you always ask is what is the cloud and what does it really mean for our business? So things have really evolved in the last few years, and what we see happening is more things are becoming virtualized on your networks, because we've been fortunate enough that virtualization has allowed us to combine things together a little bit from a hardware perspective, but it's also added complexity and layers in a different way. So if you want to jump to the next slide here, Tom. When you start talking about the cloud, like really what is the cloud? The cloud is essentially, in my mind, just a metaphor for the internet. You know, marketers have really popularized the phrase in the cloud to refer to software, platforms, and infrastructures that are sold as a service remotely through the internet. Typically, the seller has physical servers which are hosted and have products and services that you're accessing from a remote data center, so that the end users don't have to maintain any of that infrastructure. They can simply log into the network without installing anything or just installing a light client. The major models of cloud computing services are kind of broke out in a couple things. You'll hear the term software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service that different providers are providing. You'll hear about Amazon, Google, IBM, Oracle, Rackspace, Salesforce, Microsoft. They all have these offerings, and everybody has a little different spin on it, but it really breaks down to providing a service so you don't have to do it yourself. And you know, if we think of it from a different analogy perspective, everybody could run a generator or have some way to create electricity to run your equipment, but we all choose to go through a utility company that provides it. And really, that same concept is what's being applied to IT now, where you just pay for what you use. You know, if you've been around in the IT world for a really long time, if you want to jump to the next slide here, Tom, you all know that back in the day, IBM in the 60s had what they call a service bureau. And basically, they rented computer resources. In the 70s and 80s, these were really big. Everybody was jumping to it. And somewhere in the late 80s, early 90s, desktop computers became an affordable option. People started building on it themselves. And what happened is, because we had the ability to have more computing power locally, affordably, people started adapting to that environment. And VPNs started coming to connect offices together, and it made it easier for everyone to build their own private cloud, in my mind. But just because you can doesn't really mean you should. And what we find is that although customers can do it, and a lot of us do it, there's not a lot of us that are really good at it. And even if you can't affordably do it on a scale like the large data centers can. And if you look at your environments, typically speaking, your computers are running like maybe 10% of the resources that you had. And with that, if you could load it more, you could, but the problem is you have to build for those peak cycles. So if you're a Target or a retailer like that, you know, like on Black Friday, you need to build up so that when you have a whole bunch of people at your checkout line, that they have the availability of resources. So the only way you can do that is to scale for the worst case scenario instead of your everyday scenario. So it's kind of where this whole premise comes from, because just because you need a lot of horsepower today doesn't mean everybody else does. And if you share the pool, you can get a lot more for a lot less. So if you want to kind of jump ahead here, down to the next slide. So when you start looking at cloud solutions, you're going to see there's a couple different models. And if you go through Microsoft stuff, they preach that everybody has a cloud. It's just a matter of whether it's a private cloud or a public cloud. And from a private cloud perspective, historically, there were 7 layers. You had your storage, networking, your compute layer, and then on top of that, you had the operating system, the runtime, applications, data, and access. In the last 5 years or so, that's kind of morphed, and we've added what I'd consider like an 8th layer to this. And you have this virtual machine layer now, so you can separate the operating systems and data and applications from the physical architecture. This is really a huge mind shift change for those of us in IT, but also offers a lot of flexibility that we didn't historically had. You now have the ability to restore stuff and move it between machines much easier. And this is what kind of opened up the whole cloud computing to make it affordable for everybody. So if you want to jump to the next slide here. So when you start looking at public models, there's really 3 different models. There's an infrastructure as a service. If you've been in the news a lot, you know Microsoft is making a lot of press and stuff with their Azure platform. And one of the unique things about the Azure platform is it allows you to use it in any of the models. So in an infrastructure as a service model, which AVC does for some of our clients, we have Microsoft with their Azure platform take care of the storage, the computing, and the networking piece of it. Then we have the ability to custom build virtual machines, the application stuff on top of that, and provide it as a service to our customers. If you click next here, Tom, and it kind of shows here who manages which piece. Jumping onto the platform as a service, this is kind of an interesting area and where Azure really started its core base around. And if you go back, a lot of people think Azure is a pretty new concept and a pretty new platform for Microsoft. It's really not. Azure's been around for over 10 years already, but it was originally designed just from a development perspective. And what Microsoft did early on is they provided everything up to the actual application and the data and access piece. And you know, different areas where you might think that you haven't used an Azure backend, and you probably have, a lot of websites are running there. If you used Hotmail back in the day, it was built on the original Azure platform. A lot of mobile client type applications, whether it's for an iOS, an Android, or a Windows phone, are running on the Azure platform as a service type model. If you jump ahead here, Tom. And looking at software as a service, this is kind of a newer area that you're seeing a lot of development in. Applications like Office 365, SharePoint, CRM, Salesforce, there's lots of them out there that are providing software as a service. And this is where we're seeing a lot of attention from our clients, because the analogy that I think fits best is if you think of it from a telephone perspective. Everybody pays for a telephone service. They know they pay by the line, and they pay for how many calls they make, and everything just works. And if it doesn't, if you don't have a dial tone, you know who to call, and they take care of fixing it. That's pretty much how a software as a service platform works. It's usually based upon how much data you're going to use and how many users you're going to have. And we're seeing a lot of adoption of this model, and you're starting to see products like Navision offered in this, and also CRM, Salesforce, all these different types of what used to be only enterprise platforms that you had to host yourself are now being able to be done through a cloud computing model, and being able to offer it at a much cheaper service with a much more reliability, redundancy, and stuff than you could historically afford. So back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Ben. So, it really goes back to the question from earlier, when did you decide to get in the IT business? And, as you can see, it's a fairly complicated model. And the answer for most businesses is likely a mixed environment. And, we've got kind of a mixed group on our call today. There's some executives that I see, there's some IT leaders that I see. And, usually within the IT group, there's some nervousness around this topic because people look at it and they think, oh my God, everybody's going to eliminate my job. But what we see really, that isn't the case. It's a shifting of responsibilities. And I'd be willing to bet that your computer network today probably looks a lot like the case for Amazon or Microsoft and others. Most of the time, it's hardly getting used. You had to build it for that peak capacity. You had to build it for that time when all the users were in, when we were in heavy production, when we were posting lots of transactions. But the fact is, if you could build your network so that it was ready for that peak load capacity, but then when you didn't need it to be at peak, it could be scaled down and you only had to pay for what you were using, this is what we're beginning to see have some pretty big economic benefits for companies. So, the approach is really, let's look back at the past history and try to guess, what am I going to need for the next 3 to 5 years? If you're going to rebuild your network today, and many of our customers are at that spot where they need to do a network refresh. And so if you're thinking about an on-premise solution, we really need to build that network for the next 3 to 5 years. And so we all have to go through a lot of planning. We spend a lot of time. You invest a lot of your own resources. You spend a lot of time with your partner who you're working with to help build that network. And then you try to build that network based on your best plan. The challenge is that in order to be ready for that peak load at any time and to be ready for the possible growth that you see in your business, you have to put out a lot of capital at the front end that, really statistically is only going to be leveraged a very small percentage of the time. So from an upfront cost perspective, we feel like if you could keep much of that capital in your business and really use that capital to grow your business, to expand your markets, to better serve your customers, that you're going to be better off as a company, and that the cloud options that are now available allow us to very reliably and securely build an environment that meets for your current needs and then scale it only as you need to scale it. And you can scale it both up or down. When you build a network based on future growth, and then for whatever reason your plans change, well, your network's built. If like in 2008 and 2009, businesses contracted for many people, well, I've still got a network that's fired up for a large increase. And I may not need all of that. And so the flexibility financially that you gain from being able to have an infrastructure that expands or contracts as you need it can be very beneficial. Because in these models, you only pay for what you use. So what's that mean? Well, you get more for your money at the end of the day, and you get yourself out of the IT business. And so when you can take the resources that you currently have and you allow them to be more strategic about how you want to have your networks configured, what types of services might you be able to expand? The complaint we hear over and over from key executives in particular is that they'd like to get more information out of their computer systems, but they end up spending all of their IT resources just keeping those systems running and performing. And so the IT shift is really getting you out of that tactical day-to-day IT business and more into the strategic aspects of those businesses. How might we better present data for our executives? How might we better present data for our operational staff so that they can make better decisions when they're in our distribution centers or they're on our shop floors? How can we get better data for our sales team so that they can serve our customers better in the moment when they're face to face? These are all key initiatives for IT groups that require staff. So really it's about a retooling of an IT business, not the elimination of an IT business. The other thing that you get is geo-redundancy. You get scalability. And these two things are fairly misunderstood terms. But really what it means, the geo-redundancy in particular, is that it's a fancy word for meaning you get backups and failover resources in multiple geographic areas. So, when you build a disaster recovery plan, and many of you have very expensive disaster recovery plans, the fact is that you only have that in a couple of locations at best, because it's simply not economically feasible to put it in more spots than that. But with a Microsoft-based solution or some of the other cloud provider solutions, they actually can instantly transfer your data in your environment among multiple locations so that the odds of going down due to a natural catastrophe are very, very low. Security. Ben and I talk about this an awful lot, but when you think about the security in your business, the concern that many owners in particular express about their data has to do with their competitors. The average person isn't trying to figure out your recipe for how you make your product, but your competitors might be interested. And the fact is that the place that your competitors are probably going to look for your data is in your four walls. And the easiest way, when people say, well, my data is most secure when it's in my building. And I was with a Microsoft executive recently, and he told this story, and it really rang a bell. We were talking with a friend in the life sciences industry, and he was very concerned about his IP, and he said, I just don't know I want to let it out of my business. And he said, so you think your network's very secure? He said, oh, it's very secure. He said, really? He said, because I believe that if I rented a truck and smashed through the wall of your office, I could load the server and get away with everything long before the police would get there, and I would take everything that you had. It was a quiet moment in the room, because it was true that if someone really wanted your data, the place they would get it is in your business. And we all think about these elegant hacks that, some fancy computer programmer from China or Russia or one of our competitors is going to figure out how to get inside our network. He said, if I really want your data, the best way to do it is a physical attack and just go take it. And with a cloud solution, none of those options are really available. No one knows exactly where your data is at any given moment. And that adds a lot of security that you simply couldn't afford in your normal course of operations. A couple of other benefits that we see is that applications are kept up to date all the time. So many of our customers get behind the curve with technology because refresh and paying annual maintenance and doing the physical upgrade has been so difficult. But we're seeing more and more of our providers really change. And so, what the term used to be an upgrade, and an upgrade was a very expensive proposition. And, so for some of our friends that are on older versions of NAV, there's still one more relatively painful upgrade until you get to the current version. But once you're there, it's much more like an update. It'll be the new software will be pushed out similar to the updates that you get on your cell phones or in your gaming environments. The updates come out, you press a button, the update completes, and you move on down the road. And we really thought this was a lot of fiction, but we've seen it happen. They did it live for us in a couple of technical events recently, and they have really mastered this technology. And it's going to enable users to stay current. And what that does is it keeps everybody on the same versions of software. So not only your core enterprise software, but also your Office applications, Word and Excel, other collaboration tools. And when everybody's on the same version, it enables them to share data and to work collaboratively much more effectively. So, when we get back to the topic, what does this mean and why should you do it? It really starts with a conversation. One size does not fit all, and you need to sit down with your IT service provider and just have an open conversation about your strategic vision for your company. And then create a plan that supports that vision. And as we said earlier, likely it's a hybrid plan. Many of our customers we have had some customers move entirely to the cloud, and they've been very happy, and they would be happy to speak to any of you that want to visit with them. But what we're seeing more is that some things will move to the cloud and some things will stay on site. And it's just because that was a practical decision that fit best for that company. And then once you have your plan, you have to execute. And that execution isn't a one-time event. The other thing that we've been trying to do more with our customers, and we'd encourage you to do this with your IT partner, is to have a cadence, to meet once a quarter, sometimes more often if you've got a very dynamic environment, and really do an update. Talk about where have things changed, how are things working, what might we want to tweak. Because when you have that regular cadence, then we can do a much better job helping you make sure you stay ahead of the curve instead of trying to catch up. And then you can get back to running the business that you thought you were in instead of trying to run the IT business that you find yourself in. So, at this point, we're going to open it up for questions. I'll unmute everyone. And if you have questions for Ben or I, certainly feel free to ask them. And if you don't want to ask them out loud, you can type them into the chat window, and I'll be happy to direct those questions to Ben. Ben, I see one question here coming in the chat window. It said, how long does it typically take to create a deployment moving someone from on-premise to the cloud? Oh, I muted Ben. Sorry, Ben, go ahead.
I'd like to answer that if I could. What we see, typically speaking, is there's a planning stage that needs to go in. And just to make sure that, if you pick on email as an example, it's probably one of the most commonly deployed apps, or the first steps to the cloud. And everybody thinks it's pretty easy, and in the grand scheme of things, it is. There's complexities, though, because you might have security groups or distribution groups set up in your email. Everybody has scanning and all these type of things that go through email now. So there's a planning stage that's required, and that's usually the worst part of the whole equation. But typically speaking, like if you look at an email migration, most of that stuff will happen within 2 or 3 weeks from the point that a customer says we want to go to getting there. And if you're looking for a first step to the cloud, so to speak, I think an email migration from an on-premise Exchange server is a no-brainer, both from a cost perspective, but also gets your feet wet and gets you into an environment that you start seeing the benefits quickly. The cost is pretty minimal to get there, and I think it really starts opening up your eyes to what you could do with a more mobile application than what you historically had.
Thanks, Ben. I've got a couple more questions that have come in here. One is that if we move our system to the cloud and we decide to come back out of the cloud, how do we get our data back out of the cloud?
That is a really good question, and one a lot of providers don't want to talk about. So depending upon the solution, that answer varies dramatically. If we want, I'll just give a couple examples that are easy to discuss, and then, with your specific applications, you have to go down that road on each one individually. But if you had an email environment out, like if you moved your Exchange out, the easiest way, obviously, is everybody has a PST file on their machine already, so you have a backup of your data on your own. So if you want to migrate, the tools to migrate off of that application are pretty simple to do. If you're looking at something more complex, like a nav environment, you have to work with your provider to make sure that they'll provide you backups of your data that you can restore locally if you wanted to, or with another provider. And talk some of this stuff through ahead of time, because some solutions are very easy to get out of, and some aren't. And like in a nav environment, if you don't own your licensing, well, you can get the database on your own. You can put that into a SQL environment if you want to run nav after you move off. If you're on a subscription platform, you'd have to buy the license at that point. So there's a lot of variables you have to factor into that.
Thanks, Ben. And then I've got two more here. What happens if we lose our internet connection?
So in most cases, if you lose your internet connection, you lose availability to those tools. Now, the things that we talk about, when you start building out an ROI, it becomes fairly easy to justify having redundant connections. And on top of that, the thing I always tell people is you can always go to another place to get connected to run your stuff. In most cases, when you sit down with a customer and we walk through what your top software or applications needs are for your business, email is usually number one or number two. So it doesn't matter if it's on-premise or off, you need an internet connection to do it. And then your ERP application will be right in that same order of one or two or sometimes three, depending on the business. And if you're doing some sort of data acquisition, a lot of times there are solutions to be able to keep that while it's offline, or, like I said before, redundant connections is an alternative. And there's a lot of businesses that don't have an option for a redundant connection from a landline perspective, but there's a lot of wireless options in. I mean, we have some clients that have hotspots through Verizon that you can connect right into your backbone that will give you the full redundancy without even knowing that you're going through that connection. And with 4G speeds now, you can get enough speed to run in a minimal approach while your main connection's down.
Thank you. And then two more questions. One is we're considering a change to our backup strategy. Is the cloud a viable backup solution?
So short answer is absolutely. Longer answer is you got to look at what your restore time is if you have a disaster. From an archival perspective, I think a cloud backup for an on-premise environment is a no-brainer. And we have some interesting packages that are really pretty reasonable if you're interested in it to look at. But if you're looking at it from a restore perspective, if you have a terabyte of data on-premise and your server goes down, you need to restore a terabyte of data, that is going to be a long, painful process from a cloud solution. Can I get a couple files quickly? Absolutely. But to restore a complete environment, it's not a great solution. There's a lot of platforms, though, like our cloud backup platform, where you can plug a local network-attached device in, so it'll make a backup locally and it'll make one to the cloud. So if you need to do a large restoration, you have the files locally but you also have that geo-redundancy from a cloud backup. So that's something that you got to plan in, how quickly you need to restore and how much data you need to restore in a time frame.
And then the last one that I see here, unless somebody comes up with another one, is we mentioned that we have some clients that are running their entire business in the cloud. What kind of feedback have we been getting relative to response times?
Can you build on what you mean by response times? I'm not sure I'm following.
Let me see here. All right, looks like they're typing. How responsive is the system? Has there been slowdowns, and are they experiencing speed degradation?
So the clients that we have that are fully 100% hosted tell us that there's very little, if any, difference from a application performance perspective. The caveat I will put on that is if you are used to applications that are locally installed that have a local client, it'll probably perform the same. If you're going to a web-based application that's using a browser instead of a client, you will notice that it acts differently. And it's just the way the web browser is designed, because it has to refresh, where some things on an application, if it's a local client type of application, it doesn't have that refresh issue that you'd have with a true browser-based application.
All right. And then got one more here. From a nav perspective, has anyone found a vendor that hasn't worked in the cloud? Oh, I'm sorry, Ben. Have we found any ISVs that have not worked properly in the cloud?
So that's a trick question. There's a lot of ISVs, so I can't confirm or deny all of them by any means, but the primary ISVs that most of our clients run have stuff that will work with a 2015 platform in the cloud and work 100%. There are, on occasion, like a slight nuance where maybe the one-click client doesn't necessarily work perfect, but like if you do a full Windows client install, it would work. So there's some little exceptions and stuff like that, but I would say as a whole, if the 2015 side of things will all work. And with 2013 R2, we generally recommend an upgrade to 15 to get the newer client, because it performs much faster.
The other thing I would add to that, depending on the ISVs that you might be using, is that Microsoft really has made it clear that their strategy is cloud first. And so any of the ISVs that are certified for Dynamics, so that CFMD certification, they're going to require that they are ready to work in the cloud. Okay, Ben, I think that's all the questions. Any other questions? We'll sort of make a last call, and then, I'll go to our final slide, which is just an offer. If any of you have been considering potentially investigating the cloud, or you're considering that as part of your strategy, ABC would like to give you a 3-day free trial or 30-day free trial of Dynamics Nav and or Office 365 in the cloud. That offer will run through the end of the month, so certainly contact your account manager. And I know some of you, I see on the call, I don't believe you're current customers. If you don't have an IT partner, we'd love an opportunity to talk with you and see if we might be a fit. And seeing no other questions, we're going to thank everyone for your time today. Hopefully you found this presentation helpful and informative. It will be recorded and saved on our website, so if you want to share it with any of your colleagues, feel free to do so. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.